Hello and welcome to Principles of Economics with Professor Klein at Cuesta College. Today I'm doing a quick video for the Production Possibilities Frontier. I'll be doing two examples, so this is video 1 of 2. And so it's a lot easier if I can just write some of this out on the whiteboard, so that's what we're going to try to do today. All right, so with the Production Possibilities Frontier, it's all about understanding comparative advantage by understanding opportunity cost. So first we need to start with some assumptions, some information. And so we're gonna go with two countries, Colombia and Mexico, producing two goods in this example. So they're gonna produce coffee and sugar. And so the point of this example is that we can understand how to graph a production possibilities frontier, how to determine who has comparative advantage, and then we're also gonna prove that trading will make both of these countries better off. All right? Okay, so we have Mexico and Colombia, and they are going to trade coffee or produce coffee and sugar. All right, and so first we're going to go with how much they can produce. So for this example, we're going to say that Mexico could produce up to 100 tons of coffee. Or, and this is the key thing here, right? Or they could put all of their resources towards the production of sugar. And if they put all of their resources towards the production of sugar, we're going to estimate that they can produce 20 tons of sugar, right? So this is an or statement. Either they put all of their resources, such as land, labor, capital, towards the production of coffee, right? So if you just think about land, they put all they do is grow coffee beans in their land, or they cut that down and put in a bunch of sugarcane fields, right? And so this comes back to, you know, what can countries produce? So for Colombia, right, we're going to assume that they can produce 40 tons of coffee. And again, none of this is real. These are made up examples. Or 80 tons of sugar, all right? So one of the first things that is really helpful, you'll notice in economics, we do graphs all the time because it's essentially how to visualize the data. That's what a graph is. We're looking at data, all right? So when we do a production possibilities frontier, we're simply gonna choose the two goods, right? And so that's the one thing that's different. When we get to supply and demand, these will be constant, consistent. Right? But for now, we have two goods that will change for each example. So it doesn't matter because they are two goods that will change for each example. So I'm just going to put coffee on the vertical axis and sugar on the horizontal axis. I could switch this, and all that matters is that I plot the correct things. Okay, so for Mexico, if they did coffee, we're just going to call this one up here 100 tons. Right? And again, this is or. So if they're producing 100 tons of coffee, they are producing no sugar, right? So this is 1 point on the production possibilities frontier. Or they could produce 20 tons of sugar, right? So we'll call this 20 tons. And again, this is a point of what they could produce. If they put all of their resources towards the production of sugar, then they get no coffee. Right? And so what we're going to assume right here is we're going to assume constant opportunity costs. And what this means, what this assumption allows us to do is draw a straight line. What it's saying is that every unit of sugar we give up, we're going to give back the same amount in coffee. Right? And so this is what we have to start with is what is the opportunity cost? What do we give up every time we produce 1 ton of sugar? And I'm starting with sugar because in this example, it's actually the easiest one. So I'm going to get to that in just a moment, but I'm going to finish graphing Colombia. So Colombia can produce 40 tons of coffee. All right. And so we're going to put that right here at 40 tons. And so again, that is a point on the graph. Right? And so at 40, they would produce no sugar. Or they could be producing 80 tons of sugar, and at which point they would have 0 coffee. Right? Tea looks a little bit weird. There we go. All right, so now again, I'm drawing a straight line, and that is a representation of constant opportunity cost, saying that the first unit of coffee we give up will get us the same in sugar as the last. So this is one of those things that in reality doesn't hold. In reality, we call this increasing opportunity cost, because the more I give up of coffee, the less I'm going to get back, and vice versa. All right, so let's do now who has comparative advantage. Well, let's first look at Mexico. All right, and so Mexico can produce either 100 tons of coffee or 20 tons of sugar. And when I say the opportunity cost, we just want to think about what is 1 ton of coffee worth, right? So in terms of, in this case, and this is where it gets a little difficult, we always think in prices, but really prices also tell us the value of one thing in relation to another. So for example, a pencil might cost us 25 cents, right? A computer might cost us $500. One of the things that that price is telling us is that a computer is then roughly 2,000 times more useful than a pencil, right? Which I think that's roughly what it's representing. So in this case, we don't have price, but prices all come from this idea eventually. So what is one coffee worth? So we use the principles of mathematics here. So how do I get 100 to equal 1? And how do I do that consistently? Well, you divide by the number. So in this case, in order to get 100 tons of coffee to equal 1, I'm going to divide by 100, right? And so now, in order to get me the opportunity cost, I take the 20 tons and divide by 100. And so this tells me 1 ton of coffee is worth 20 100ths, or 1/5. Or if you prefer decimals, 0.2, right? Now, for comparative advantage, this is the opportunity cost. 1 ton of coffee. Every time Mexico gives up 1 ton of coffee, they can get back 1/5 a ton of sugar. So how then, if we wanted to think about this in terms of sugar, what should I do, right? And so the way that we do this for sugar using the same information over here, but now we want to know what 1 ton of sugar is worth, right? And so we would take the 20 tons of sugar divided by 20. We give up 100 tons of coffee. And so what we get is 1 ton of sugar is worth 5 tons of coffee, right? And so notice when we just did this a moment ago, 1 coffee was 1/5. So these will always be the inverse of each other, or the reciprocal. So before, 1 ton of coffee is worth 1/5 of sugar. It will always follow then that 1 sugar is worth 5 coffee. All right? So when we look at these examples of who should produce what, right? First, we need to determine opportunity cost. And so once we've gotten this part, right? So here we have Mexico. I'm going to redo this table in a way that helps me think about who has the opportunity cost. So now we're going to do the opportunity cost of 1 ton of sugar. And so when we talk about the opportunity cost of 1 ton of sugar, it's always going to be priced in coffee. And when we talk about the opportunity cost of 1 ton of coffee, it's going to be done in terms of sugar, right? And so for Mexico, we've already determined this, right? So remember, it was 20 tons of sugar or 100 tons of coffee. We also still have this in the graph right here. All right, and so for Mexico, the opportunity cost for 1 ton of sugar was 5 tons of coffee. And the opportunity cost for 1 ton of coffee was 1/5 a ton of sugar. Now, for Colombia, what is their opportunity cost? And so when we have constant opportunity costs, we also have that this would be the slope, the negative, right? Because when we get one, we're giving up one, so it's a negative slope, right? They are opposing. And so we have Colombia can produce 40 tons of coffee or 80 tons of sugar, right? So we know there's going to be a 2 there somewhere, but where's the 2? 1 ton of coffee. Every time they give up 1 ton of coffee, what are they going to get back? So again, we can think about, we have to divide by that same number. And so every time they give up 1 ton of coffee, they're going to get back, and so make sure we put it in the right space, 2 tons of sugar. And then if we understand that, and we're sure that we've gotten this one correct, it will always follow that this is the inverse or reciprocal, right? So this is now 1/2 a ton of coffee. So this is the last and particularly important step here. So now that we have this in a way that we can organize, and this is the part about why do we use so many tables and graphs in economics? Tables help us organize our thinking. Graphs help us visualize the data so that we can tell better stories. So when we look at this, we want whoever gives up the least amount to specialize. So when we look at sugar, Mexico gives up 5 tons of coffee to produce 1 ton of sugar. Colombia, however, only gives up 1/2 a ton of coffee. So who should produce sugar? It's whoever gives up the least. So Colombia, this is why I do it this way, this is the smaller number. It tells me that this is the activity that they should specialize in. And vice versa. Which of these is smaller, 1/5 or 2? Oh, look, it's 1/5, right? And so this tells us that Mexico should specialize in coffee, and maybe you already guessed that because they have an absolute advantage in coffee. And Colombia is going to specialize in sugar because they also, it happens to work out that they had the absolute advantage in sugar as well, right? And now what we're going to find is even when they trade, right, they're both going to be able to produce beyond their production possibilities frontier. All right. So a brief break as I erase this, and then we'll come back and prove that. Okay, so I have rearranged my board just a little bit. And so notice I have changed this to, we now have established that Mexico will specialize in the production of coffee. And here I've rewritten my opportunity cost. 1 ton of coffee, they give up 1/5 a ton of sugar. Colombia is going to specialize in sugar, right? And 1 ton of coffee is they're going to give up 2 tons of sugar. This is important, and we need to know the opportunity cost before we figure out these trade assumptions, all right? So notice I have 2 fill in the blanks here. So these are things that can change, right? So both parties will win as long as the opportunity cost, as long as the trading terms, that's what we call this, what we're willing to trade a ton of coffee for in terms of sugar, as long as this falls within the 2 countries' opportunity costs, both parties will win, right? So Mexico, 1 ton of coffee, they give up 0.2 or 1/5 of a ton of sugar. Colombia, when they give up a ton of coffee, their opportunity cost is 2 tons of sugar. So there's a lot of space here, any number between 0.2 and 2. So what I'm going to go with is probably the easiest number we could figure out between there. We're going to trade 1 for 1. 1 ton of coffee for 1 sugar. And again, this could be anything between, it would need to be greater than 0.2 because Mexico's not going to give it up for anything that isn't at least 0.2 because otherwise they could produce their own. But it also just simply has to be less than 2, right? That's what Colombia is saying. That's what Mexico is saying. So we could go at 1.5, we could go at 0.5, we could go at 0.75, right? And so I'm just choosing the only whole number that is in between those 2 opportunity costs. And then we also, just to finish the example, this is not so important. Obviously, we simply cannot trade more than we produce, right? So we're going to ask how much coffee should we trade? I'm going to go ahead and say we're going to trade 40 tons of coffee. because that will probably show us the easiest way of proving that trade makes us better off. So again, this can be any number. Mexico is producing coffee, so it can be any number up to 100, right? Probably not 100 because then they are left with no coffee, unless they really love sugar and they're just better at producing coffee. That's always a possibility. We have lots of countries that actually trade away most of the things that they produce because they need things that they can't produce. All right, so finishing up this example. So we're gonna trade 1 ton of coffee for 1 ton of sugar. And we've also said that we're gonna trade 40 tons of coffee, right? So Mexico is going to produce 100 tons of coffee because we've already said that they're going to specialize. And Colombia is going to produce, because they're only going to produce sugar, they're going to produce 80 tons of sugar. Okay, and so now Mexico is going to send Colombia 40 tons of coffee, right? So that is Mexico sending it to Colombia. So what does Colombia have to send back? And this is where we needed these assumptions, right? So they're trading 1 for 1, and they're trading 40 tons of coffee. So that's where we got this 40 tons, okay? And so they then have to send back 40 tons of sugar. Did they have 40 tons of sugar? Yes, they had 80 tons of sugar. So now, what does Colombia have? Better marker. So Colombia gets, right, they have 40 tons of sugar. Sorry, they have 40 tons of coffee that they received from Mexico. All right. And then they had to send away 40 tons of sugar, but what are they left with? 40 tons of sugar. That is going to be some sweet coffee, right? And so here, if we look at this, here our black line was representing Colombia before. This is what they were stuck at. 40 tons of coffee meant that they got no sugar. And now look at, here is where they are consuming. A previously unattainable point. They can consume here, they still cannot produce here. So they are now consuming more goods than they could produce if they only consumed what they produced, right? So this line still tells us what they are able to produce, but now they're able to consume more than they would produce. Is Mexico still going to be better off, as an example? Let's finish this up. So Mexico produces 100 tons of coffee, right? They had to send 40 tons away. So how many are they left with? They are now left with 60 tons, right? Now, when they give up 60 tons, before we trade, every time they gave up 1 ton, they got 1/5 of sugar. So if they had willingly, right, given away 40 tons and produced only 60, well, 40, 1/5 back would be 8, right? So this point right here is 8. They would be able to produce 60 tons of coffee and 8 tons of sugar at the same time. But what are they going to get? Well, they've sent away 40, right? That 40 went to Colombia. So they still have 60 left. But what did they get back from Colombia? 40 tons of sugar. And there's Mexico's new consumption point. They're still constrained, and this is why we specialize. We specialize because we're still constrained, but we get better at the activity, and then it becomes easier, and then we can sell it or trade it, and then we can use that to buy other things that we wouldn't be able to consume, or sorry, to produce, right? So I don't make my own clothing. You probably don't make your own clothing, right? Because we go to work, we specialize in whatever we're doing. For me, teaching economics. For you, who knows? Maybe it's a waitress or a bus driver. Who knows? Whatever your job might be right now, or whatever you want it to be in the future, you're specializing, and then you're going to go to work, receive pay, and this is our way of avoiding barter, right? And we'll talk about the functions of money in Unit 4. Hope this has been helpful. You can always rewatch this. And if you have any questions about how I got any of these numbers, please send me an email or ask for an office hour. Have a great day.